It was a late October evening in 2017, and I had just finished another long, grueling shift at the sawmill. I was exhausted, my muscles aching from a hard day's work, and I was desperate to get home. My truck, a battered old pickup with local plates, was my only lifeline back to my small cabin tucked deep in the woods. The drive usually took about an hour, cutting through the winding roads of a sprawling national forest. Most nights, it was a peaceful ride, the kind where I could let my mind wander. But that night, everything felt off. The sun had dipped below the horizon quicker than I expected. Out here in the sticks, once the sun goes down, it gets pitch black fast. No streetlights, no reflective signs, just darkness broken up by the faint glow of my headlights. I pulled onto the main two-lane country road that snaked through the forest, and that's when I spotted them. A large black SUV, a Tahoe, creeping along the road in front of me. Its out-of-state plates glinted briefly in my headlights. First, I didn't think much of it. Tourists were common in the area, especially in the fall when the leaves turned fiery shades of red and gold. But it wasn't long before my frustration began to simmer. They were driving painfully slow, not even hitting 25 miles per hour on a road where 50 was the norm. I figured they were lost, their speed a result of indecision or unfamiliarity with the area. I kept my distance, hoping they'd eventually pull off or speed up. But they didn't. I tried to pass once, but as soon as I sped up, they did too. Their brake lights flared as they adjusted their speed to match mine, keeping me boxed in behind them. It didn't make any sense. Why wouldn't they let me pass? I cursed under my breath, gripping the wheel tightly as I settled back into place behind them. Maybe they didn't notice me, I told myself. But the longer it went on, the harder that was to believe. The road was a narrow, winding ribbon cutting through dense forest. Tall pines loomed on either side, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. It was the kind of place where you didn't want to take risks. No guardrails, sharp turns, and steep drops. I wasn't about to gamble with my life just to overtake a group of idiots who didn't know how to use their turn signals. Then came the abrupt turns. Without warning, the Tahoe would swerve onto a side road, tires kicking up gravel and leaves, only to slow down again. And by sheer bad luck, every single one of those turns happened to be the exact route I needed to take to get home. It was almost comical, like they were deliberately trying to keep me behind them. I groaned in frustration, my patience wearing thinner with each passing minute. After nearly an hour of this nonsense, I'd had enough. My cabin wasn't far now, maybe 15 minutes away, and I wasn't about to let these clowns hold me hostage any longer. I gave my truck a bit more gas, closing the gap between us. I was done keeping a respectful distance. I threw on my blinker, hoping they'd take the hint. They didn't. Instead, they slammed on the gas. The SUV roared ahead, and suddenly we were both flying down the road at breakneck speeds, 70 miles per hour on a twisting mountain road, surrounded by nothing but trees and darkness. My heart pounded as I gripped the wheel, trying to keep my truck steady. The thought of a deer darting out or hitting a patch of loose gravel crossed my mind more than once, but I was too angry to care. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I managed to overtake them. My truck had more power than their overloaded Tahoe, and I pushed it hard, pulling ahead by 100 yards or so. I kept my foot on the gas, wanting to put as much distance between us as possible. Their headlights shrank in my rearview mirror, but they didn't disappear entirely. Their high beams flicked on, blinding me momentarily as I rounded another curve. I cursed again, adjusting my mirrors to block out the glare. I was almost home. The last stretch of the road was a straight shot, and I could feel the tension in my shoulders start to ease. But something still felt off. The way they had sped up to block me, the way they stuck to my tail like glue. It didn't sit right. Were they just paranoid tourists, lost and scared in an unfamiliar place? Or was it something more sinister? I turned onto the gravel driveway leading to my cabin, my tires crunching over the loose rocks. The headlights behind me disappeared as I crested the hill, and for a moment, I let myself breathe. But as I pulled into the clearing where my cabin sat, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, parked just a few yards from my front porch, was the Tahoe. Its engine was off, its windows dark. It had no reason to be there. No one else lived this deep in the woods. My stomach churned as I killed my own engine, sitting in the cab of my truck with the headlights still on, illuminating the SUV. I waited, watching for any sign of movement. Nothing. The Tahoe just sat there, silent and unmoving. I reached under my seat, my fingers brushing the cold metal of the crowbar I always kept there. My heart was racing now, adrenaline coursing through me as I considered my options. I could confront them, but something about the situation screamed danger. After what felt like an eternity, the driver's side door of the Tahoe creaked open. A figure stepped out, their face obscured by the shadows. They didn't move toward me or the cabin. They just stood there, staring. I couldn't see their eyes, but I could feel their gaze, cold and unrelenting. Then, without a word, they climbed back into the SUV and drove off, the sound of their tires fading into the night. I didn't sleep that night. Even after I locked every door and window, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next morning, I found fresh tire tracks leading back to the main road, but nothing else. No footprints, no signs of a struggle, nothing to explain why they'd been there. To this day, I don't know what they wanted or why they followed me. Maybe they were just lost. Maybe it was a case of paranoia gone wrong. Or maybe they had more sinister intentions and changed their minds at the last second. Whatever the reason, I never saw that Tahoe again. But every time I drive through the forest at night, I can't help but check my mirrors, half expecting those headlights to appear again. I was fly fishing in a remote canyon deep in the Sierra Nevada mountains. It was the summer of 1986, and I had taken a few days off work to escape the noise of the city. At 33, I preferred the solitude of the wild, and this trip was my way of reconnecting with nature. The canyon was known for its pristine waters, towering cliffs, and trout that hadn't learned to fear a well-cast line. The closest road was miles away, and there was no cell service, not that it mattered then. I liked the isolation. It sharpened my focus and made the world seem simpler. The day had started perfectly. The sun climbed high into a cloudless sky as I hiked along the rocky trail that led to my favorite stretch of the river. I had been here before, but not often. The steep switchbacks made for a grueling hike, and the uneven terrain wasn't for everyone. That's what I liked about it. Few people ventured this far, leaving the fish plentiful and the surroundings untouched. When I arrived, the river sparkled in the sun, winding its way through the canyon like a ribbon of liquid glass. Pines and firs lined the banks, their reflections shimmering on the surface. The air smelled of damp earth and resin, with a faint sweetness from the wildflowers blooming nearby. I set down my pack, assembled my rod, and tied on a fly that resembled the insects skimming the water's surface. I spent hours casting, wading knee-deep into the cool water, and listening to the canyon's sounds. The rush of the river, the chirping of birds, and the occasional rustle of leaves. But as the afternoon wore on, I noticed an odd sound, soft pops echoing through the canyon. At first, I thought it might be rocks falling, as they sometimes did from the cliffs above. But the sound was different, almost rhythmic, like the crack of distant fireworks. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent, coming and going without any pattern I could discern. I tried to ignore it. I wasn't here to puzzle over strange noises. I was here to fish. The trout were biting, and my focus stayed on the water. I hooked a few, all good-sized, and released them after admiring their shimmering scales. but the popping sound lingered in the back of my mind, nagging at me like an itch I couldn't scratch. Around mid-afternoon, I decided to take a break. My legs were tired from standing in the current, and my fingers were stiff from tying knots. I found a flat boulder near the water's edge, shaded by a massive pine. The tree's trunk was easily 3 feet in diameter, and its roots sprawled across the rocky ground like the veins of the earth. I leaned against the boulder, pulled out my fly box, and started selecting a new pattern. The sun was still high, but the canyon walls had begun to cast long shadows, cooling the air. The popping sound returned, louder this time. It seemed closer, too, like it was coming from somewhere just beyond my line of sight. I paused, fly in hand, and scanned the canyon. Nothing seemed out of place. The trees stood still, the river flowed smoothly, and the sky was as clear as ever. I told myself it was probably just the heat causing sap to burst in the pine trees or something equally mundane. Still, the sound unsettled me in a way I couldn't quite explain. I turned my attention back to my fly, threading the tippet through the eye of the hook. As I tied the knot, I felt a faint tremor beneath me, like the ground was shifting ever so slightly. I froze, my heart picking up speed. Then came a sharp crack, deafening and unmistakable, followed by a series of snaps and groans. I looked up and saw the massive pine swaying unnaturally, its trunk splitting at the base. Everything seemed to slow down. The tree was falling, and it was falling right toward me. I didn't have time to think. My body moved on instinct, adrenaline surging as I pushed off the boulder and leaped into the river. The cold water hit me like a shock, soaking me to the bone. I stumbled on the slick rocks but managed to stay upright, turning just in time to see the tree crash down. It hit the boulder where I had been sitting, splintering on impact. The force of the fall sent shards of wood flying, some landing in the river near me. My fly rod, which I had left leaning against the boulder, was obliterated, snapped into pieces and crushed under the weight of the tree. The fly line tangled in the branches, broken in multiple spots. The sound of the impact echoed through the canyon, drowning out the river's rush. I stood there in the middle of the water, chest heaving, staring at the destruction. If I hadn't moved, I would have been pulverized. The boulder was cracked where the tree had struck it, and chunks of bark and wood littered the ground. The popping sound that had haunted me all day suddenly made sense. It had been the tree's trunk weakening, warning of its impending collapse. The reality of how close I had come to death hit me like a second wave. My knees buckled, and I sank into the water, letting the current push against me. I was alive, but barely. If I had hesitated even a second longer, I wouldn't be here. The thought made my stomach churn. I stayed in the river for a while, too shaken to move. The canyon was eerily silent now, as if the fall had scared even the birds into silence. When I finally climbed back onto the bank, I avoided the area where the tree had fallen. My pack, thankfully, was untouched, lying a few feet from the carnage. I grabbed it with trembling hands and began the hike back to my car. The trail felt longer than it had that morning, each step a reminder of how fragile life is. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting another tree to fall or the canyon walls to give way. By the time I reached my car, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting the mountains in a golden glow. I threw my gear into the trunk, climbed into the driver's seat, and sat there for a long time, hands gripping the wheel. Driving back, I couldn't shake the image of the tree crashing down, its branches splintering and scattering like shrapnel. I thought about how isolated I had been, a full hour's hike from any kind of help. If that tree had hit me, no one would have found me until it was too late. It wasn't just the fall that scared me, it was the sheer randomness of it. There was no warning, no reason. Nature didn't care about my plans or my life. It simply acted indifferent and unstoppable. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the tree falling again, felt the rush of wind as it missed me by inches. The canyon had always felt like a sanctuary, a place where I could escape the chaos of the world. But now I realized it was as dangerous as it was beautiful, a place where the smallest misstep or moment of bad luck could mean the end. I haven't been back to that canyon since. The memory of that day stays with me, vivid and unrelenting. Sometimes I hear the sound of popping wood in my dreams, and I wake up in a cold sweat, heart racing. It's a reminder that no matter how prepared or careful you are, life can change in an instant. And out there, in the wild, you're at the mercy of forces far beyond your control. In the summer of 2013, my hiking partner Ben and I set out to complete the Sierra Crest Trail, a rugged and remote route that cuts through the towering peaks of California. It was a dream we'd both been planning for years, but as the days stretched on, the dream began to feel more like a test. By the time we reached Huxley Pass, nearly 12,000 feet above sea level, the exhaustion was visible in our every movement. The thin air clawed at our lungs, and the rocky trail had battered our feet. Still, standing on the pass with jagged granite peaks stretching as far as the eye could see, I felt a sense of accomplishment. The weather that morning had been perfect, clear skies and a light breeze, but in the Sierra, weather can turn without warning. I noticed clouds building to the south, dark and heavy, and a glance to the north revealed another ominous formation rolling in. I mentioned it to Ben, and we agreed to descend quickly. The last thing we wanted was to be caught in a storm at this altitude. The descent was slow. Loose scree made every step treacherous, and as we dropped into the valley below, the wind began to pick up. By the time we reached Evolution Lake, the first drops of rain had begun to fall. We found a spot near the lake to pitch our tents and debated whether to wait out the storm or keep moving. The decision was made for us when the skies unleashed a fury I had never experienced. Rain came down in sheets, soaking us to the bone within minutes. The wind howled like a living thing, ripping at our gear and threatening to tear the tents from the ground. Thunder cracked overhead, so loud it felt like the mountains themselves were splitting apart. Lightning struck the ridge above us, sending loose rocks tumbling down the slopes. I remember watching in stunned disbelief as a boulder the size of a small car bounced down the hillside, smashing through trees and crashing into the ground mere yards from where we stood. "Get behind the ledge," I shouted, though the wind stole the words from my lips. We scrambled to a rocky overhang, pressing ourselves flat against the cold granite as debris rained down around us. The ground shook with each impact, and the sound was deafening. When the barrage finally eased, we knew we couldn't stay where we were. The hillside was unstable, and every gust of wind threatened to dislodge more boulders. We grabbed our soaked gear and made a desperate dash toward the lake, hoping to find a safer spot. But the lake had its own dangers. The nearby creek, which had been a gentle trickle just hours earlier, was now a raging torrent. Water surged over its banks, carving deep channels into the ground and sweeping away everything in its path. The air was freezing, and our wet clothes clung to our skin, sapping what little warmth we had left. We moved again, this time to a flat area near the lake. It wasn't ideal, but it was the only place where we could pitch a tent without fear of flooding or falling rocks. We worked quickly, our hands trembling from the cold, and managed to set up one tent before collapsing inside. The storm raged on outside, and I could feel the temperature dropping even further. My teeth chattered uncontrollably, and I knew we were in danger of hypothermia. Our sleeping bags were damp but not soaked, and in desperation, we stripped out of our wet clothes and climbed in. Huddled together in the small tent, we shared what little body heat we could. My fingers and toes were numb, and I could feel my thoughts growing sluggish. a sure sign that the cold was winning. At some point, exhaustion overtook us and we passed out. When I woke, sunlight was streaming through the tent, and the air was stiflingly hot. I crawled outside and was hit by a wave of heat so intense it felt like stepping into an oven. The storm had vanished as quickly as it had come, leaving behind a landscape that looked like a battlefield. Rocks and debris littered the ground, and the creek was now a wide, muddy scar. Our gear was scattered, some of it lost to the flood, but we were alive. We spent the morning drying our clothes and repacking what we could salvage. The heat was oppressive, and by midday, the temperature had climbed to 95 degrees. The contrast from the freezing storm the night before was almost surreal. As we began the trek down the valley, the weight of what had happened hit me. We had come so close to disaster, and yet the mountains didn't care. They would remain indifferent, eternal, while we were just passing through. That night, as we camped in a lower, safer valley, I couldn't shake the feeling of insignificance. The storm had reminded me of just how small and fragile we are in the face of nature's power. And as I lay there, staring up at the clear, star-filled sky, I felt a strange mix of gratitude and unease. We had survived, but the mountains had made one thing abundantly clear: survival was never guaranteed. It was a crisp fall evening when we decided to go camping. My dad, who had served in the military for over 20 years, had invited his old sergeant, Sergeant Davis, along for the trip. I wasn't too excited about having a military man around, someone who probably spent too much time talking about tactics, survival, and other things I didn't understand, but my dad insisted. It was supposed to be a bonding trip, he said, to reconnect after a few months of him working long hours. We drove out to a remote spot in the woods, far from any towns or major roads. The drive was long, but quiet, and my dad and Sergeant Davis kept to themselves, mostly talking about old missions, the people they worked with, and a few war stories I didn't want to hear. I could tell Sergeant Davis wasn't quite as relaxed as my dad. There was a sort of alertness in his eyes, like he was always scanning the horizon even when there was nothing to see. I didn't think much of it at the time, though. I was too focused on the dense forest surrounding us as we drove deeper into the wilderness. When we finally arrived, the sun was beginning to set. The campsite was secluded, nestled between towering pine trees and a rushing creek. My dad had brought along a large tent, a few folding chairs, and the usual camping gear. Sergeant Davis, being a bit of a perfectionist, started inspecting the area immediately, making sure there were no signs of animals or anything that could pose a threat. My dad set to work on the fire, and I went about gathering firewood, trying to avoid being too involved in the conversation between the two men. Night fell quickly, and as the fire crackled and flickered in the darkness, the atmosphere seemed to shift. The woods grew quieter than usual, with only the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, even though I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. My dad seemed at ease, as always, but I noticed Sergeant Davis kept glancing over his shoulder every few minutes. His hand was never far from his backpack, where I knew he kept a rifle. We ate around the fire, and the conversation turned to something lighter. My dad told some funny stories from when I was younger, and Sergeant Davis shared some wild adventures from his time in the service. It was all fine until the conversation took a sudden turn. "I've been out here before," Sergeant Davis said, his voice a bit lower than usual. "A long time ago, in the mountains. You wouldn't believe what we found out there." We all fell silent for a moment, the crackle of the fire the only sound. I didn't know what he meant by that, and neither did my dad, but I could tell the mood had shifted. It was as if a shadow had crept into the air, and it made the campfire feel smaller, less comforting. The night seemed colder. "What did you find?" I asked, trying to break the tension. Sergeant Davis looked into the fire for a long moment, and then he shook his head. Something that shouldn't have been out there. That's all I'm saying. Sometimes nature hides things that it doesn't want anyone to find. My dad shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I could tell he didn't like where the conversation was going either. But Sergeant Davis wasn't done. "Look, it's not just about what you can see," he continued, lowering his voice even further. "Sometimes you can feel it. Something's wrong, something's out of place. And that's when you get the worst feeling of all. The feeling that you're being watched." I laughed nervously, trying to brush it off. "What, like some creepy animal or something?" Sergeant Davis looked up at me, his eyes sharp. "I don't mean animals. I mean something else." I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I didn't say anything. I tried to focus on the fire, but my mind kept drifting back to what he said. Something else. What could that even mean? I couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness around us seemed deeper now, as if it were closing in. The night dragged on, and we eventually went to bed. My dad and I shared the large tent while Sergeant Davis set up his own nearby. The woods outside seemed eerily quiet, and I could still feel that unsettling sense of being watched. The darkness felt thicker, heavier, and no matter how many times I told myself it was just my imagination, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I tried to sleep, but it was difficult. Every little sound made my heart race. A twig snapping, the rustling of leaves, the distant howl of an animal. I lay there in the darkness, staring at the ceiling of the tent, wondering if Sergeant Davis was right. Was there something out there? Something we couldn't see? My dad was already snoring softly beside me, completely unaware of the creeping unease that was gnawing at me. Then, in the middle of the night, I heard it. A soft rustling, not far from our tent. I froze, listening intently. The wind was calm, and there were no animals moving around. This was something different, something deliberate. I gently shook my dad awake. "Dad, wake up," I whispered urgently. "I hear something." He groggily turned toward me. "What is it?" "I don't know, but it's close. Too close." My dad's eyes went wide, and he sat up, pulling a flashlight from his bag. "Stay here. I'll go check it out." He unzipped the tent and stepped outside, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. I could see him scanning the area, but he didn't seem alarmed. He walked slowly, methodically, like he was expecting something to happen. I stayed in the tent, heart pounding, listening for any sound that might confirm what I feared. Then I heard it, a soft voice, distant but unmistakable. It wasn't a whisper, it was too loud for that, but it was something low, guttural, almost like an animal growling. I couldn't make out the words, but it was unmistakable. Someone or something was out there. I couldn't stay in the tent any longer. I grabbed my flashlight and rushed outside, my mind racing. My dad had stopped at the edge of the clearing, staring off into the trees. His body was tense, and I could see that the light in his eyes had shifted from curiosity to something darker. "Dad, what is it?" I asked, my voice shaking. He didn't respond at first. Instead, he pointed into the trees, toward a spot where the darkness seemed deeper than it should have been. I followed his gaze, trying to make sense of it. That's when I saw it. At the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the shadows, was a figure standing motionless. It wasn't moving, but it was large, its outline indistinct in the blackness. My heart dropped into my stomach as the figure slowly shifted, as if it were aware of us, watching us. Then, without warning, the figure stepped into the light, revealing its form. It was tall, too tall, and its body seemed unnatural, like it didn't belong in the woods. Its arms were too long, its features too vague. It wasn't human, not in any way I could understand. I didn't even think. I turned and ran, my feet pounding the ground as I sprinted back toward the tent. My dad shouted after me, But I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I dove into the tent, gasping for breath, my heart racing in my chest. My dad followed me in a few moments later, slamming the door shut behind him. "We need to go," he said, his voice steady but urgent. "Now." We didn't pack up. We didn't gather anything. We just grabbed what we could and ran. The eerie figure still standing out there in the dark, watching us from the edge of the trees. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. It was the longest run of my life, and the fear that gripped me made it feel like the woods would never end. But we made it. We left that place behind, and when I looked out the window one last time, I swear I saw the figure still standing there, unmoving, as if it were waiting for us to return. We didn't talk about it on the drive home. The only sound was the engine and the occasional crackle of the radio. I glanced over at my dad once in a while, but he never said a word. Neither did I. I don't know what we saw that night, but I know this. Some places hide things that don't belong, and some things should never be found. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway. My cousin Derek, a scientist working on some research project at a university, and his wife Sarah had planned this camping trip for months. They'd been itching to get away from their busy lives in the city. I, on the other hand, had been itching to get away from mine too, so I tagged along. I didn't expect much, just a few days in nature, some stargazing, maybe some fishing if we felt like it. The plan was to head to a secluded spot up in the Cascade Mountains, about 2 hours out of town. Derek was fascinated with the outdoors, but more from a scientific perspective. He loved studying plant species and the effects of climate change on ecosystems. Sarah was the opposite. She was a city girl through and through, but she'd always gone along with whatever Derek wanted to do, probably because she trusted him completely. We made the drive up, with Derek driving his old, beat-up SUV and Sarah navigating. It was late afternoon when we arrived, and the sun was starting to dip behind the mountains. The air had that fresh, crisp feel that only comes with being deep in the forest. The campground was remote, hidden away from any main roads, and it had no cell service, which I found a little unsettling but also kind of refreshing. We set up camp near the edge of a small creek. The sound of running water was calming, and the area was surrounded by tall trees, some old-growth pines, their trunks thick and gnarled. I didn't think much of it at the time, but looking back, there was something off about the place. It felt like something was watching us, though I couldn't put my finger on why. Derek and Sarah were both in high spirits, busying themselves with their usual tasks. Derek was setting up a weather station he'd brought along, something he'd use for research, and Sarah was laying out the sleeping bags. I, however, was just enjoying the peace and quiet, getting some firewood for later and listening to the faint rustling of animals in the woods. That night, we sat around the fire, eating simple camping food, hot dogs and canned beans. It wasn't gourmet, but it didn't matter. The fire crackled, and the stars above were bright, more numerous than I'd ever seen them. There was no light pollution here, nothing but the wilderness and the night sky. But as the night wore on, I started feeling uneasy. It wasn't anything specific, no strange sounds or movements, but more of a creeping sensation, like something was off. Maybe it was just the isolation of the place. Maybe it was because I hadn't gone camping in years. Either way, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Around midnight, I went to the edge of the campsite to relieve myself. The trees were thick, and the night was so quiet it felt like the entire forest was holding its breath. As I stood there, something caught my eye, a figure in the distance, barely visible between the trees. I froze. It wasn't moving, but it was there, just standing. It wasn't a person, at least not like any person I'd seen. Its outline was too large, too unnatural. It didn't have a clear shape. It was like a dark mass, hard to define, but it was definitely something. I quickly zipped up and hurried back to the campfire, my heart racing. I didn't want to say anything to Derek or Sarah. I knew they'd brush it off, but I couldn't shake the image of that thing standing there in the dark. It was like the forest itself was alive, watching, waiting. That night, I didn't sleep much. The fire had died down, and every snap of a twig, every rustle in the leaves, made my heart skip a beat. I kept hearing things, scratching noises, something moving just beyond the firelight. But every time I looked, there was nothing there. I even thought I saw a shadow move through the trees, but it could have just been my imagination. The next morning, I tried to brush it off. Derek and Sarah were up early, making breakfast over the campfire. I made a point not to mention what I'd seen the night before. I didn't want to sound paranoid, and I figured it could have been an animal, maybe a bear or a deer. Still, something felt wrong about it. And the more I thought about it, the more I started to feel like we weren't alone. That day, we went for a hike along a nearby trail. The weather was perfect, with a light breeze and the sun shining down through the canopy of trees. We didn't talk much during the hike. Derek was too focused on collecting samples and taking notes for his research, and Sarah was lost in her own thoughts, probably wondering how much longer we had before we could go back to civilization. But as we hiked deeper into the forest, the feeling of unease grew stronger. I couldn't pinpoint it. Nothing seemed wrong, but I felt like we were being watched. Every crack of a branch underfoot, every gust of wind through the trees, set me on edge. When we finally returned to camp, we were all tired, and the tension in the air seemed to lift a little. We spent the rest of the afternoon just lounging around the camp, talking about random things, mostly to distract ourselves from the eerie feeling that had settled in the back of my mind. That night, I insisted on staying up a little later, hoping to catch whatever it was I'd seen the previous night. Derek and Sarah went to bed early, exhausted from the hike. As I sat there, watching the fire flicker, I couldn't shake the thought that something was lurking out there in the dark. It was about 2 a.m. when I heard it. A low, dragging sound, like something heavy scraping along the ground. It wasn't an animal, I could tell. It was deliberate, slow, almost like it was testing the ground beneath it. I grabbed a flashlight and stood up, my pulse pounding in my ears. I shone the beam of light into the darkness, but there was nothing there. The noise stopped as soon as the light hit the trees. My heart was racing, and I couldn't bring myself to go any closer. I sat back down by the fire, trying to shake off the fear creeping up my spine. I told myself it was just an animal, but the doubt kept gnawing at me. Why had it stopped as soon as I shone the light? And why hadn't I heard any other noises since? It wasn't long before I heard something else. Footsteps, moving around the edge of the campsite. They weren't human footsteps, though. They were uneven, heavy, and they were getting closer. I stood up, this time with no intention of waiting for it to reveal itself. I grabbed the axe near the fire and walked around the camp, trying to spot whatever it was. I felt stupid doing it, but the tension in my chest was unbearable. The footsteps stopped, and the forest fell silent again. That's when I saw it, a shape moving quickly between the trees. It was dark, blending into the night, but I could just make out the outline of something tall, massive. It wasn't a man. It wasn't an animal. It was something else, something inhuman. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed, staring at it. It seemed to notice me, its eyes catching the light of the fire for just a second. But it didn't move toward me. It just stood there, watching. I could feel its presence like a weight in the air. I don't remember when I decided to go back to the campfire. I just remember walking back slowly, trying not to make a sound. I never told Derek or Sarah. I couldn't bring myself to. They would have laughed, or worse, they would have dismissed it as nothing. But I knew what I'd seen. I knew it wasn't natural. The rest of the night was tense, and I didn't sleep at all. The sounds from the forest kept me awake, and I kept thinking I could hear something moving around the campsite, just out of sight. By morning, I was done. I didn't care if it was only daybreak. I wanted out. Derek and Sarah were still asleep when I packed up my things. I didn't tell them what had happened, but I made it clear I wasn't staying another night. I'd had enough. We left the campsite, and as we drove away, I glanced back at the forest one last time. Something about it felt off. I don't know what I saw that night, but I knew it wasn't something I ever wanted to encounter again. We haven't gone camping since. It was late October when I decided to take a solo camping trip in the mountains. I'd been hiking a few times before, but never on my own. This trip was meant to test my limits, to see how well I could handle being alone in the wild. I had planned everything meticulously: maps, supplies, the right gear. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, figuring it was a quick, low-risk trip. I parked at a trailhead about 2 hours from the nearest town and started hiking up the trail at around noon, with the mountains rising steep and imposing before me. By the time I reached my campsite, the sun was already starting to dip behind the peaks. I was aiming for a secluded spot by a small creek. The path was narrow and winding, with the trees growing thicker as I climbed. It was peaceful. The sound of the leaves rustling in the breeze was calming, and there wasn't another soul in sight. The air had a sharpness to it, the kind you only get in the mountains, with that crisp bite of autumn starting to settle in. I set up camp without any trouble, unfolded my tent, rolled out my sleeping bag, and unpacked my stove for a quick dinner. The creek was a little ways off, but the sound of it running over rocks kept me company. As the evening turned darker, the air started to feel heavier, like a storm was brewing. I didn't think much of it at first. It was mountain weather, unpredictable, sure, but I'd been in storms before. I built up a small fire and sat back, watching the flames crackle and pop, warming my hands. The first raindrops hit the ground about an hour after the sun had completely disappeared. At first, it was light, a gentle patter against the leaves. But then the wind picked up, rustling the trees more violently, and the rain started coming down harder. I zipped up the tent and retreated inside to escape the growing storm. It wasn't long before the rain turned into a downpour, the noise deafening as it struck the fabric of my tent. The wind was howling now, whipping the trees around so violently that I could feel the ground tremble under my feet. I tried to ignore the storm. The wind and rain were loud, but I figured it was just a passing squall. But then, around midnight, I heard something strange. The wind had settled for a brief moment, and in the silence that followed, I thought I heard something else. A low, rhythmic tapping on the side of my tent. It was faint at first, just a soft thud. My mind tried to make sense of it. Maybe it was just the wind shifting the tent poles, or a tree branch scraping against the fabric. But then it came again, a bit louder this time. Top, top, top. I held my breath, my heart starting to pound. I could hear nothing but the pounding of the rain and that strange sound. It was too regular to be just the wind. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag, my hands trembling slightly as I flicked it on, casting a beam of light across the inside of the tent. I quickly checked all the zippers and seams. Everything was sealed tight. Nothing looked out of place, but the tapping continued. I froze, trying to tell myself it was just an animal. Maybe a curious raccoon or a squirrel, something harmless. Still, the sound didn't sit right. It was too deliberate, too steady. It came again, louder this time, followed by the faintest crunch, like something heavy had stepped on a twig. I crawled out of my sleeping bag and unzipped the tent flaps slowly, careful not to make a sound. My heart was thudding in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears. I aimed the flashlight at the ground near the tent's entrance, scanning for anything that could explain the noise. Nothing. The rain was coming down so hard now that the beam of light barely pierced the darkness beyond the tent. The trees swayed violently in the wind, and the creek's roar had grown louder as the rain swelled it. I wanted to dismiss it, tell myself I was just hearing things, but there was something about the tapping that didn't sit right with me. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself it was just an animal. I unzipped the tent all the way, stepping carefully outside, keeping the flashlight's beam low. The air was cold, the rain soaking through my jacket almost immediately. I scanned the area around my campsite. Nothing. The trees were swaying in the wind, but everything else was still. The creek had grown more aggressive, its waters crashing over rocks in a frenzy. I took a few hesitant steps away from the tent, shining the light across the ground. It wasn't until I turned to look behind me that I saw it. A figure. It was standing just at the edge of the tree line, barely visible through the rain. It wasn't moving. I could barely make out the shape, but it was tall. Taller than any person I'd ever seen. The shadows made it hard to see any details, but the silhouette was unmistakable. A person, or something that looked like a person. I froze, every muscle in my body screaming for me to run, but I couldn't move. The figure stayed still, almost too still, as if it was waiting for something. The cold hit me like a slap, my breath visible in the air now. I could feel my pulse in my throat, thudding in time with the rain. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure turned and disappeared back into the forest. I stood there for what felt like forever, staring into the darkness where the figure had been. The rain continued to fall in sheets, but now the noise seemed distant, muted. The forest was so quiet now, I could hear the rush of my own blood in my ears. I didn't know what I was supposed to do. I wasn't about to chase after whatever that was. I quickly rushed back to the tent, double-checked all the zippers, and huddled inside, my heart racing. The tapping started again, even louder this time. Tap, 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 like someone was pounding on the side of my tent. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound seemed magnified. The wind howling, the rain crashing against the fabric, the rustle of leaves. The tapping continued off and on throughout the night. I didn't know if it was real or if my mind was playing tricks on me in the dark. By morning, the storm had finally passed, leaving the mountainside soaked and foggy. The sun was barely rising, the clouds hanging low in the sky. I packed up my camp in a daze, my hands shaking as I folded my tent. The air was thick with moisture, and the ground was soggy beneath my feet. I didn't see the figure again, but something told me I wasn't alone. The hike back down the mountain felt endless, every step accompanied by the feeling of being watched. I didn't stop until I reached the trailhead, the safety of the car a relief I couldn't describe. I never went back to that spot. I still don't know what I saw that night, whether it was just a trick of the light or something else entirely. But the sound of that tapping, the figure standing in the rain, it's something I can't shake. And every time I see the mountains in the distance, I remember that feeling, that deep, unsettling sense of not being alone. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend. Just me, my 2 dogs, Max, a scrappy terrier mix, and Luna, a calm but alert shepherd, and the quiet of the forest. I had booked a spot at a remote campsite I'd heard about from a friend. It was located just outside a small town in the Pacific Northwest, somewhere tucked away where not many people went. The weather forecast had been clear, or so I thought. The drive there had been easy, the roads wet from light rain, but nothing that seemed concerning. I was used to camping in the rain. It's part of the experience, right? But I never expected what the weather would turn into that night. I set up camp under the large pines, the ground soft but firm enough to hold my tent in place. The site had a little fire pit, though I had no intention of using it. The rain had started up again, steady at first, then increasing to a downpour as soon as I had finished unloading my gear. I shrugged, knowing it would pass. I made a quick dinner for me and the dogs, a simple canned stew for myself and some dry kibble for them. They didn't mind the rain at all. In fact, they seemed to love it. Max, being the little adventurer he was, ran around, jumping in puddles and barking at the rain as if daring it to do its worst. The sound of the rain hitting the tent was soothing at first. The steady rhythm made the world outside feel like it didn't exist. I thought I'd be able to read, maybe listen to some music, but the sound of the rain was so loud, it drowned out everything else. So, I just sat there, relaxing, letting the dogs settle down beside me. Luna curled up at my feet, and Max sat with his back against the tent wall, his ears twitching every now and then as if listening for something. It wasn't long before I realized the rain wasn't letting up. It wasn't just a storm anymore. It felt different, heavier. There was something about the intensity of it that felt unnatural, almost like it had changed from a normal weather pattern into something more persistent, like it was trying to wash away the entire world around me. I didn't think too much about it at first. Camping in the rain wasn't ideal, but it wasn't a huge issue either. But as the night wore on, I began to notice odd things. The wind had picked up, but not in a normal way. It wasn't the usual gusts that would blow through the trees, shaking the branches and making the leaves rustle. This was a strange, steady pressure. It felt almost like the trees were leaning toward me, pressing in around the campsite. I remember thinking that if I focused on it too long, it might drive me crazy. So, I tried to distract myself, playing with Max and Luna, but that's when I first heard it. A soft rustling, not the sound of the wind moving through the trees or rain hitting the leaves. This was something else. It was faint, like the sound of something brushing against the brush or the undergrowth. The dogs heard it too. Max stopped, ears straight, his tail stiff as he stared toward the edge of the forest. Luna, as calm as ever, only raised her head slightly, sensing something, but not reacting with the same intensity. I stood up slowly, trying not to startle them. The rustling continued, but it was impossible to tell if it was just the wind or something else. I glanced around the campsite, but the tense glow from the small lantern didn't reveal anything. Then I heard something else. A low thud, followed by another. It wasn't close to the campsite, but it was enough to make me uneasy. The dogs went quiet, their eyes trained on the darkness outside the tent. I waited for a while, listening intently. The sound stopped, but the air around me felt thick, oppressive. I figured it was just a deer or some other animal wandering through, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something I couldn't see. I checked the gear inside the tent. Everything was still in place, but when I went to check the campfire pit, I noticed the wet wood was still untouched, the kindling I had laid out completely soaked. I had expected it to at least be a little damp, but not completely waterlogged. I decided to call it a night. It was only around 9:30 p.m., but the rain had made everything feel later. I crawled back into the tent, zipped it up, and lay there, staring at the rain falling in sheets against the fabric. The dogs lay at my feet, one on either side. The world outside felt distant, like we were in some sort of bubble, cut off from everything. That's when the noises started. The rustling was back, louder this time, closer. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't rain. It was deliberate, like something or someone was moving deliberately through the wet underbrush. I froze, trying to stay as still as possible. The dogs tensed, their ears perked. The sound stopped. I didn't dare make a move. Could be an animal, maybe a bear, though I hadn't seen any signs of bear tracks around. Or maybe just a large elk. But no, the sounds weren't right for an animal. It sounded too human. I held my breath, listening intently. Max was already growling softly, barely audible, his body trembling. Luna, who was usually the calm one, started to shift nervously beside me. I stayed perfectly still, trying to listen for any other sounds. But all I heard was the rain, the steady drip of water off the trees and the leaves. Then I heard a voice. It was low, a whisper barely above the rain's steady rhythm, too faint to understand, but unmistakable. It was a human voice. I held my breath, straining to hear. It wasn't a conversation. No words exchanged, just something unsettling in the tone. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I couldn't see anything in the darkness outside. Nothing moved, and the dogs were dead silent now, their eyes wide, locked on the entrance of the tent. The voice came again, clearer this time. It was faint, but I could make out a few words. "Stay out here." I didn't understand what it meant. Why would anyone be out there, in the pouring rain, in the middle of nowhere? I thought maybe it was a lost hiker or someone in trouble, but the voice didn't sound like it was calling for help. It was more like a warning, or worse, an invitation. Max started to bark. It wasn't loud at first, just a few sharp barks, but soon it escalated. He was frantic, scratching at the door of the tent, trying to get out. Luna, on the other hand, just sat there, staring at the entrance, not moving. I grabbed Max and pulled him back, but as soon as I did, there was another sound, louder this time. A sudden, sharp crack, like something heavy had broken a branch or knocked into a tree. The dogs went completely silent, and the air grew heavier, colder. I decided then that I wasn't going to wait around to see who or what was outside. The rain had become almost deafening, and I knew that if I waited any longer, I might not make it out of the tent. I grabbed my flashlight, flicked it on, and began unzipping the door slowly. The rain was so thick that the light barely reached more than a few feet. That's when I saw it. A figure. It was standing at the edge of the trees, just beyond the circle of dim light from my tent. It wasn't moving. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its outline was blurry in the rain. My heart raced as I realized it wasn't an animal. The figure didn't have the shape of any animal I had ever seen. I froze. The dogs whimpered, huddled behind me. I didn't dare make another sound, and for a long, terrifying moment, the figure just stood there, unmoving, watching me through the rain. I don't know how long we stayed like that. My body was trembling, my mind racing. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure turned and disappeared back into the forest. Just like that, it was gone. The rustling stopped, the air seemed to clear, and the feeling of pressure lifted. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my things, tossed them in the car, and drove as fast as I could, the rain still pouring down in sheets. I didn't look back. Later, I found out that there had been reports of strange disappearances in the area years ago, but nothing had been confirmed. Whether it was a person or something else, I'll never know for sure. But I'll never forget that night.